This is PowerPoint 1.1 on Reconstruction. It is consistent with web link number 35 in conjunction with that. All right. Reconstruction is largely, just kind of to begin with an introduction. The first part of the first History 1, U.S. History 1, we deal with an inherent conflict in the Constitution between national sovereignty and state sovereignty, which ultimately is settled by force of arms in the Civil War. What begins really with this Reconstruction is the second inherent conflict in the United States Constitution, which remains masked, kind of hidden, in the first history course, which is the conflict between the executive and legislative branches. That is now going to come out in Reconstruction in the continuing contest between Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, and the U.S. Congress, which is dominated by Republicans. Now, we want to remember that from this point until the end of this epic one, until 1900, the Republican Party will dominate the U.S. Congress, and will dominate the U.S. Congress largely because the Democrats controlled the South prior to the Civil War, and they get held accountable for the Civil War itself and for the secessionist movement. Okay, now, the first problem with Reconstruction you see here with the Freedmen's Bureau is you can't simply free all the black slaves because they are an uneducated and unskilled population. For them to become relevant players in the game, so to speak, you have to educate them. And so the Freedmen's Bureau will become the first social welfare program. The U.S. government will kick the money to educate the slaves so that they can be a viable workforce. And remember that one of the problems with the slavery is, I do this in my U.S. History 1 classes, go over the economic difficulties of slavery. One of them is that at the time of the Civil War, you had approximately 4 million slaves. And this was a loss of potentially 4 million consumers in the developing economy of the United States. And so in an attempt to make them viable players in the game, viable consumers, we first have to educate them so that they can get good jobs, and they need good jobs so that they can buy things. Same reason we're all in college, right? We need a good job so that we can buy things. Now, 40 Acres and a Mule refers to something, an initiative by Sherman as he marched to the sea at the end of the war. He would confiscate Southern property in Field Order number 15, and then give 40 acres and a mule to the slaves. This ultimately was reversed by Congress because it was determined that Sherman had dramatically overstretched his authority. And they'll set up instead the Southern Homestead Act, which is consistent with the Homestead Act of 1862, which promises 160 acres to anyone that will develop the land. This is effectively what the Southern Homestead Act will do as well. Now, in terms of the sharecropping system, we want to be clear on this because the slaves' position improved only marginally with freedom because of the creation of a sharecropping system. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with it, a sharecropping system means that the owner of the land provides all of the necessary materials, all of the equipment, all of the seed, all of everything. Okay. In exchange, they get a percentage of the product. Now, as a result of that, it was generally about 50%. In addition, they would sell the slaves everything they needed. They would charge them rent, they would charge them everything. And so the freed slaves went from being slaves to being debtors. And the people that held the note on the debt were largely the plantation owners. As a result of this situation, a lot of the blacks, once they were freed, migrated to the north. This is the great urban migration, and we'll talk about it again. Now, the problem with this is that the U.S. economy will commence through the 19th century a rapid increase in production, okay, a rapid growth cycle. The problem is that it's not rapid enough to soak up all of the labor that's going to influx the North, principally from the freed slaves in the South. And you see that's what it says there is a strain on the labor demand to absorb the freed slaves. Now, the final thing you see on this slide is the Southern reaction to this. And again, we'll deal with this again throughout the 19th century and then into the 20th century, particularly beginning in the 1920s, is Southern reaction to this. You can legislate equality for the freed slaves, but you can't, force people to think of them as free. The Southern states will commence a series of initiatives to prevent the freed blacks from actually engaging in what will be their equal rights. Now, their equal rights will be given to them by the 14th and 15th Amendments, and we'll deal with those in just a second. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal treatment for all U.S. citizens, regardless of race, creed, color, or condition of previous servitude. The 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights, neither of which can be very strictly enforced. There's no real ability to enforce it, and it's up to the states to enforce. And so throughout the end of the 19th century, there won't be anything. Jim Crow laws will ultimately be the forerunners that we'll see later on in the 1950s, separate but equal laws. Black codes forbid blacks from doing certain jobs, prevent blacks from living in certain areas. And then, of course, the famous Ku Klux Klan will form in 1866, and this will be a vigilante group. It started by 6 ex-Southern Confederate officers, and it will be a vigilante group that will attempt to suppress any attempt by the blacks to gain equal citizenship. Okay, now here's the inherent conflict that I talked about in the introduction. You have 2 different Reconstruction plans. You have presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction. What we see here in this slide, presidential Reconstruction was an extraordinarily, what I would call, I guess, a soft Reconstruction plan. If 10% of the population in the seceding states, in the Confederate states, set a loyalty oath, they would be allowed back into the Union as full and equal members, as full and equal states. You see there, no equal rights were guaranteed for the slaves, and in fact, Johnson, the Civil Rights Act will be passed in 1866, and Johnson will veto that. That will be the first of the vetoes, and Congress will override it. It will again be indoctrinated in the 15th Amendment, and again, it won't be enforced through the end of the 19th century. Lincoln's assassinated in April of 1865. Johnson becomes president. Now, Johnson's plan is to reverse any confiscation of Southern property. So in the presidential Reconstruction plan, there's no intention of confiscation of Confederate property. Okay? The 13th Amendment is passed under Johnson, which ends slavery. And Johnson's plan is a bizarre one. To this day, the nation of Liberia in West Africa, whose capital, it should be noted, is Monrovia, Johnson founds Liberia. His intention is for any and all freed black slaves to go home, to return back to West Africa. In other words, thanks for 2 centuries of service, guys. We really appreciate it. Now get the hell out. Which ultimately was a dramatic failure, although it did have some success. There were some that did go back. And to this day, Liberia and the United States are very close allies. Now, Congress, on the other hand, Congressional Reconstruction, was based on vengeance against the Southern states. Okay, they wanted the Southern states they wanted retribution for the Southern states' secession. And more than anything else, to prove the point that you don't ever secede from the Union. Okay? So first of all, there had to be a majority population, not a 10% population. This is the Wade Davis bill. Blacks would be given equal rights. This would be in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which you see below, and also the 15th Amendment, or the 14th Amendment, rather. This will actually begin, the Wade Davis bill will be before Lincoln's assassination. And Lincoln will use the pocket veto. This is the first pocket veto. For those of you unfamiliar, although you shouldn't be unfamiliar because you should have learned this in your American government courses at somewhere along the line, either at Robert Morris or at one of those little high schools that everybody went to, whatever. Under the Constitution, bills that are passed by the U.S. Congress go to the president. The president can do one of two things with them. He can either sign them into law or veto them. He has 90 days to do this. He or she has 90 days to do this. If they fail to take any action whatsoever, it, by default, becomes a veto. That's a pocket veto. A pocket veto is if the president fails to act on it in 90 days. And the Wade Davis bill was the first pocket veto, and Congress did not override that veto. And you see there the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, okay, which we've talked about previously. The 14th Amendment actually is kind of an interesting one. Only recently, in the 1970s, and I'll make references like this throughout the class, but in the 1970s, a number of states began a series of initiatives known as affirmative action. California, Washington, Oregon, Michigan, a number of others. Okay, it actually became federal law. But California has since thrown it out, and they've thrown it out based on the 14th Amendment. See, the 14th Amendment was intended to create equal rights, principally for the freed black slaves, but for all Americans. Well, the intention of that, the idea behind that, is you can't prohibit American citizens from exercising their rights. But it also means that that all Americans have to be treated the same. Affirmative action, it was determined, doesn't treat all Americans the same. Okay, it gives benefits to some and not to others. For me, it gets to this. Why is it? Explain this to me. Why is it that I, a hardworking, underpaid adjunct faculty member at Robert Morris, have to buy my health insurance, okay, when people who don't have enough money get health insurance for free? Okay, either all American citizens get free health insurance, or no American citizens get free health insurance. That's the idea of the 14th Amendment. But we don't want to get up on a soapbox too early in the class now, do we? Now, Congressional Reconstruction 2, you have a series of acts, most notably the Military Reconstruction Act. This divided the South into 5 military districts and imposed martial law. The idea was to impose martial laws for the enforcement of the various bills that Congress was going to pass over the next few years. And now, you see the registration of black voters. This was principally handled by the Republican Party. This is consistent with the 15th Amendment, because when they passed the 14th Amendment, nobody really in the South paid any attention to it. Between the black laws and the Jim Crow, between the black codes and the Jim Crow laws, black voters were still not allowed to exercise their rights. And in fact, they won't be allowed to exercise their rights until the 1920s. They'll maintain things like poll taxes, education requirements, etc., literacy tests, that will deny them the right to vote. Well, the 15th Amendment is intended to, it stipulates that no Americans can be denied the right to vote. Other than, interestingly, in the 15th Amendment, women and Native Americans are not included. Women won't get the vote until 1920, and Native Americans, that would be the first election they vote in, and Native Americans won't get the vote until 1926. Now you see the Confiscation Act. The idea is to reinstitute essentially Sherman's idea of Field Order Number 15. Rebel property, particularly that of Confederate officers, is going to be confiscated, and all in freeing the slaves, the Southern states will lose about $2 billion in human property. Just prior to the Civil War, there was a plan some years back. The University of Rochester purchased 500 letters from Abraham Lincoln, and they've been releasing them bit by bit after they've authenticated their authenticity, verified their authenticity. One of them was a plan to prevent the Civil War by freeing the slaves and giving the Southern slave owners $500 per slave. Okay. In all, the slaves were worth about $2 billion. This is going to become a significant, this represents a significant investment on the part of the plantation owners in the South and on the part of the Southern states itself. And what we're going to see as we go through these PowerPoints through the 19th century is that conditions for the Southern states, which already weren't good at the beginning of the Civil War, they were already suffering from a deterioration of terms of trade, in terms of selling their products and then having to buy things. That's going to become worse. By the end of the 19th century, the southern states are going to be tremendously in debt. It's going to be one of the precipitory causes of the Depression of 1892. Okay, and you see that the confiscation of the rebel property ultimately failed because nobody would enforce it in the South. Now, the objectives of Congressional Reconstruction we've talked about. Punishment of the Confederacy. The Republicans, particularly with the registration of black voters, was an attempt for the Republicans to manipulate the electoral process and maintain control of Congress. And it actually works extremely well, okay? Because it's thought by the Republicans, correctly as it works out in hindsight, that the blacks, the freed blacks, will vote Republican because the incumbent power in the South was the Democratic Party. And so the freed blacks would serve as a counterpoise to that and vote Republican, which in fact they do. The freedman's right to vote, for reasons that I've talked about before, they'll eliminate that or limit it bit by bit. Okay, property requirements, poll taxes, meaning they have to pay a tax to vote, which and when they're in debt, they don't have money to do that. Education requirements, etc. And ultimately, the 15th Amendment, this is the problem you see here with the 15th Amendment, it does not prohibit the restriction of voting rights based on property or literacy. And so that's what they're going to use throughout the 19th century. And then we have also Southern recognition of the preeminence of national sovereignty. And you see there what I say is death of the 10th Amendment. And this goes back a little bit, and we don't want to become too tangential in going back there. But the 10th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, during the great controversy that led to the ultimate adoption of the U.S. Constitution, one of the concerns and the primary conflict that we study in U.S. History 1 is between national and state sovereignty. In the writing of the Constitution, Madison promised to write a Bill of Rights that would guarantee not only individual rights, but also the rights of the states. Okay? This is incorporated in the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says that all those rights not explicitly given to the national government are reserved to the states. This is what gets shot through the head in the Civil War. From that point forward, national sovereignty is Trump. And it ultimately gets to just kind of a side note that I want to make, which is that the United States in the Constitution envisions a federal system. The U.S. Constitution itself comes from three principal sources: John Locke's Second Treatise on Civil Government, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract, and the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was a federal system. It was a confederacy of 5 different Indian nations. Part of their Confederate agreement was that every 5 years the leadership would get together, and if anyone wanted to opt out of the Confederacy, they were free to do so. The U.S. Constitution doesn't have such a thing. And the problem with the U.S. Constitution, and it's a problem actually to this day, although it was settled in the Civil War, really, the problem up until the Civil War is there is no clear delineation between the sovereign authority of the national government and the sovereign authority of the state governments. To learn more on that, you'd have to join me in U.S. History 1. Now, Congress versus the president. This is where the showdown. The showdown already has started with, we talked just before that they had passed the Civil Rights Act in 1866, and Johnson vetoed that, and Congress overrode his veto. It was the first override of a presidential veto. Okay, now they're going to pass the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, and you see there what it stipulates, that it restricts president's prerogative to dismiss presidential staff. He has to get congressional approval for any appointees. Now, that runs contrary to the U.S. Constitution. Johnson elects this time to have a showdown with Congress over it, and he will dismiss Edwin Stanton, who is Secretary of War. Okay? Congress charges that in so doing, Johnson has violated the Constitution. Not constitutional law. He's violated statutory law. There are two reasons, and only two reasons, for impeaching a president. He has to either violate statutory law, which means he breaks the law, normal law, or he has violated constitutional law, meaning he's violated the U.S. Constitution. Okay? They charge that Johnson has violated statutory law insofar as he's violated the Tenure of Office Act by removing Edwin Stanton without congressional approval. They will engage in impeachment proceeding. Okay? Johnson will ultimately be acquitted by a narrow margin. And see, what Congress is thinking, it makes perfect sense what Congress is thinking. On two previous occasions, the Military Reconstruction Act and the Civil Rights Act, okay, Congress has amassed 2/3 in opposition to Johnson. That's how they overrode his veto. For them to impeach Johnson, they need a 2/3 majority of both houses, both the House and the Senate. Okay? They figure, the Republican leadership in Congress figures that, oh, well, we have the 2/3 against Johnson because we've overridden 2 of his vetoes. Let's now just get these 2/3 to impeach the guy altogether. But it fails, and it fails for a number of reasons. It fails ultimately because it's determined by Congress. Okay, they finally have a kind of a gut check and determine that, the Tenure of Office Act itself is unconstitutional. We can't impeach a president because he violated an unconstitutional law. And because overriding a presidential veto and having 2/3 opposition to the president is one thing. Impeaching the president is another ballgame altogether. When you impeach the presidency, you impugn the office of president itself. Okay, and they didn't want to go so far as to do that. Now, you see Southern Republican government, the way the Republicans are going to do, you see, waving the bloody flag means, and occasionally this still comes up, every time the Democratic Party makes a push to get back into power, to gain seats in Congress or to come into power in any of the southern states, the Republican Party simply has to wave the bloody flag. And this will work throughout the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, the collective consciousness, the collective memory of people in terms of the Civil War and the pre-Civil War, the 1850s, etc., has kind of faded. And people kind of forget about it a little bit. It's been 30 years, right? It's a new generation. The generation in the 1890s and at the turn of the century didn't go through. They didn't experience the Civil War. Waving the bloody flag is the Republican Party's attributing the Civil War to the Democratic Party. Okay? Now, Southern Republicans, you see they're divided into basically 3 categories. First is the native Southerners who existed prior to the Civil War, who were with the Republican Party. These are referred to as scalawags. You have the freed slaves. And then you have the carpetbaggers, which came down from the north to essentially profiteer on the destruction of the South. When they reconstructed the South and rebuilt the South, the carpetbaggers were entrepreneurs who came down and exploited that for profit. Okay. Now, counter-Reconstruction. We've talked about this briefly. There's a reactionary movement that rises up in the South. And even to this day, it's there in some parts, particularly in the deeper parts of Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, where blacks are still not really considered equal citizens. Okay? The societal resistance we see with the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, a vigilante group that exists to this day. The Ku Klux Klan is going to be very virulent. Okay, they're going to be very active through the 1870s. But by the mid-1880s, they really kind of fade away and won't have a resurgence until really the second decade of the 20th century. And you can see, if you want to, you probably go on YouTube and find it, Birth of a Nation. It's a movie about the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. Oddly enough, it was Woodrow Wilson's favorite movie. And then the Klan will become very active again in the 1920s into the 1930s, and then they'll come and go from the 40s onward, and they'll become extremely active during the Civil Rights Movement, which begins in the 1950s. Government resistance, we've talked about this before. You see the Colfax coup here, and I've got fairly much the details of it there that you can just read. The Klansmen, the White League and the Klan, the White League was another vigilante group, attacked the black militia in Grant Parish. See, the problem was, it wasn't simply that the blacks were given voting rights. It's that they constituted a majority in a lot of the areas of the South. Parish is essentially a county in Louisiana. That's the equivalent of a county in the state of Louisiana. They constituted a majority in some of these parishes. And that meant it wasn't just that blacks were going to be given the right to vote. It's that they would actually be able to hold office. They would be able to be in county government, in city government. And so they kill off 150 freed blacks, and it's essentially vigilante violence. Ultimately, 10 are indicted for the crime, and all are acquitted by white juries. Okay, and that's the last point, is the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th and 15th Amendments are never really very strictly enforced in the South. And even to this day, they're not enforced that much. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 1871 call for it, but they're not specific enough in how you're going to enforce these laws. Ultimately, this will be the idea of the development of a quota system that will essentially enforce these laws. Okay. Think that's everything. Oh, last little conclusion here. Grant's elections in 1868 and 1872, as I mentioned before, this latter 19th century is a period that's dominated by the U.S. Congress. This is why nobody can remember these presidents in the late 19th century. Okay? And that's because the presidents in the late 19th century largely become factotums. They become stooges that are basically puppets of Congress. Grant will be the first of these, and it will usher in a period of corruption. Okay, that I think concludes the discussion on Reconstruction. If there are any questions, contact me. Thank you.